Hello, this is Mr. Ting, and welcome to part 4 of my video series on how to conduct an EEI. These videos are made with secondary students in Queensland, Australia specifically, but the stuff I'm talking about will apply to any science investigation generally, so there's something here for everyone. So in this one, keeping a lab journal. Lab journals. I mean, who even invented lab journals? Well, no one really invented them. I mean, they were just something that people did all throughout history when men and women of science and research did stuff. Experiments, they just wrote down their observations. I mean, this right here is a picture of the lab notebook of Alexander Graham Bell, who you may know as the inventor of the telephone. This is in 1876 that he wrote these things. It's just what people did. And because of that, it's just become normal practice now that whenever you do any type of data collection, any type of testing, to have a lab notebook, a lab journal. So do we really need it? Is it going to make you a better scientist? Yeah. I really think it will, and here's why. Lab journals are a scientific record. They really, honestly, help you while you're doing your testing to just keep track of your work and to stay organized. Because you're writing so much stuff in it, it helps you to retrieve the information that you need anytime if you do it right now and anytime in the future. So it's a really good record of the science that you are doing. In some ways, can I even say this? In some ways more important than the science report itself that you end up writing. But lab journals are also a legal record. I mean, in it you'll see dates of discoveries, what was discovered when, and they've actually been used in many cases when people are trying to file a patent to show that they were the first to discover something. So yeah, they are very important, and we do need to figure out how to keep a good lab journal. The next question that I get often asked by students is, well, does it have to be a physical book? Can it be digital? The honest answer is, well, either is actually fine. I mean, of course, if you have access to technology, use it. If you have a digital journal that you keep, I find that it's a lot cleaner. It's easier to manage. It's neater. You're typing things in. But the physical journal is still pretty good. It's actually having an A4 size notebook. I find it's a bit more versatile, and in my experience, it kind of seems to force students to just reflect a little bit more. And in some cases, they just end up writing more and doing more analysis, more just, recording of things. It's also a bit safer to have with you when you're at, the lab bench, instead of having a laptop or a tablet around when there are chemicals and stuff. It's better to have a book there. So either way is good. I personally prefer the physical book a little bit more, but of course, either is fine. So here's some pro tips when it comes to writing your lab journal. The first thing that we always want to do is to leave space for the contents. So that's normally 1 or 2 pages at the very start. We will date every single entry. Every time that you write something, you write the date. We always make sure that there are no loose papers. Stick everything down, glue, staple them in. There's nothing that should just be shoved into the book. And the lab journal does not have to be pretty. It does not have to be this incredible, impeccable, neat, penmanship work of art. But it should be legible and detailed enough for, years later that you can still understand what was written. And finally, when you're keeping a lab journal, do not embellish or change any of the results. We just record the stuff as it happened. So do not change things. If you ever need to amend or correct something that you wrote previously, we never cross stuff out. We just make a new entry. I think you can even just if you do cross it out, you kind of put a straight line through it, but you don't actually use whiteout or tear the page out. We just keep everything in because you just never know when you might want to look back on that page again. It's like a legal record, remember? So ultimately, the goal of this journal is that if I read it, if you finish your test, and if I read your entire journal, I should feel like I was there the whole time, and that I got to see everything you tested, and that I can just really understand what went through your mind throughout the whole process. That's the purpose of the journal, to let someone be able to read it and just feel like they were actually there. So what do you actually write? Where do you start? Well, I find a really good way to think about it is to consider the scientific method. Remember that in a previous video? We saw that the scientific method consisted of observing, predicting, testing, concluding. And there are great parallels to that. Just like you start with observing in your journal, it's really great to really just start with what people will often call brainstorming. I like to call it the questioning phase. So you just kind of write down your thinking as you're kind of developing your research question, and then any of your research notes, things that you come across that just show evidence in your journal that you were doing research. That will also form the basis of your ability to make a good hypothesis. And then once you've got your hypothesis, you can start designing your test. And so I want to see that there's planning in there of your experimental design. And then, of course, when you actually do the tests, I want to see the raw data. I want to see you actually writing stuff down. None of the process stuff, right? That's for the actual report. But all the raw data should be very visible in the journal. And finally, with concluding, I want to see a reflection at the end on the results. So some kind of analysis of the results, and it's really good to have a reflection of the process, the whole process, like from start to finish. How did it go? It's not like a diary where you're telling me your feelings and everything, but you're reflecting on the process and maybe like improvements, notes for the future. So I think what most people do out of these 5 things is that maybe they do 3 and 4 a lot, and maybe don't think about 1, 2, and 5 as much. But this is really what you want to. This would encapsulate an entire journal. So some examples for questioning. These are some pictures of some past student journals that have been submitted to me, which would be A+ standards. So this student has, shown me that they've thought really hard about, all sorts of questions when it comes to this topic in microbiology. They ended up only, I think, picking like 1 or 2 things to actually look at. But, this really showed me their questioning process. Showing me evidence of research is really great as well. This can be done in all sorts of ways. A common way is by students actually just like printing some stuff out and sticking it in, like the relevant stuff, highlighting or showing that they've kind of interacted with the secondary data and have thought really hard about the research to be able to come up with a hypothesis and their entire experimental design. Speaking of which, that's the next one. I want to see some evidence of planning. I want to see in your journal that you've taken the time to just plan, timeline, for example, as you can see over here, what's going to happen when. And then the experiment itself. And the example that I have here is a student who's actually already written it out in like a report format because it's already written in past tense. But they stuck it into their journal as to show that they did planning of the experimental design. And then the raw data comes next. So this is literally like, the book is right there with you when you're conducting the experiment and you're scribbling it in. This is why it doesn't have to be very neat. But yeah, it's the very first time that you record the results. I need to see it in the journal. This is what ends up getting processed into the final version that goes into the actual report. But definitely raw data needs to be shown in the journal. I mean, that's one of the primary purposes of the journal, so you can write the data down. And then a reflection of the results and the process. This student actually did a lot of work to think about, like, for example, all the errors and limitations. They only ended up writing maybe, a third of this stuff in the actual report. But I mean, this is great. It shows me how much they thought before they actually chose the most salient, the most significant limitations and errors to include in their report. And here's another example of just a reflection of the overall process. Not your feelings or anything, but just how the overall process went. I sound like I don't care about feelings. I do care about your feelings, whoever you are, but not like, yeah. And there it is. That is the main things to keep in mind when you are putting together a lab journal. Some people don't see it as important as a science report, and sure, maybe the science report ends up having a bit more weight when it's being marked by the teacher, but it certainly is important. It's still part of the overall assessment, and to me, more importantly, it's part of doing good science that you're keeping a record of everything that you do. So all the best with that, and I'll catch you in the next video when we actually start looking at how to write a science report.